Finally, and perhaps most important, there was the pedagogy of the scribal schools, which, as we have already mentioned, was based on the memorization, recitation, and reproduction of a small body of classical, or even canonical, texts. 0.81. The usefulness of intertextual composition for both the author and the intended reader is to some extent dependent on the existence of this kind of fixed literary tradition. In fact, the establishment of some sort of literary canon is very nearly a prerequisite for the existence of intertextuality at all, or at least for its results to be comprehensible to anyone but the author. As Michael Fishbane observed, intertextuality is the core of the canonical imagination. That is, it is the core of the creative imagination that lives within a self-reflexive culture, shaped by an authoritative collection of texts. The main reason for this is that a canon, of whatever sort, presupposes the possibility of correlations among its parts, such that new texts may embed, reuse, or otherwise allude to precursor materials, both as a strategy for meaning-making and for establishing the authority of a given innovation. Put in a nutshell, intertextuality is a form that literary creativity takes when innovation is grounded in tradition. In short, Amenemope cannot be understood in isolation, but only within the context of the literary tradition of Egyptian literature as a whole, and especially that portion of the tradition which is nearest to Amenemope's own genre. Our first task, then, is to identify what that genre is, and then which other genres are most closely allied to it.
The instructions.
The easiest approach to situating Amenemope within the Egyptians' own literary categories is to start with the text's own self-description. The opening line of Amenemope, which is really the title of the work, describes it as a spait. This is a noun derived from the verb sabah, to teach. Amenemope is therefore a teaching, or as the English title of the work has it, an instruction. The espait was one of the earliest genres of Egyptian writing to emerge and certainly the most enduring. In fact, it has been suggested that of all the literary types of ancient Egypt, the instructional genre is the most easily identifiable and possesses the greatest cohesion. This is due not only to the genre's persistence throughout almost the entire span of Egyptian literary history, but also to its consistency of style and content during that time, despite the masterful and flexible use of the genre by individual authors. As Miriam Lichheim aptly put it, the instruction proved an immensely fruitful and popular genre. It was useful, enlightening, and entertaining. It lent itself to emulation and variation, and each new age filled it with new content. Though it included popular and proverbial wisdom, it was primarily aristocratic until the New Kingdom, when it became middle class. At all times it was inspired by the optimistic belief in the teachability and perfectibility of man, and it was the repository of the nation's distilled wisdom. The character of the instructional genre can be discerned in the following quotations from the instruction of Ptah-hotep, the earliest instruction for which we have a complete copy, and the one which the Egyptians themselves seem to have held in highest esteem, and quoted most often. Beginning of the formulations of excellent discourse spoken by the prince, count, God's father, God's beloved, eldest son of the king, of his body, mayor of the city and vizier, Ptah-hotep, in instructing the ignorant in knowledge, and in the standard of excellent discourse, as profit for him who will hear, as woe to him who would neglect them. He spoke to his son, "Don't be proud of your knowledge. Consult the ignorant and the wise. The limits of art are not reached. No artist's skills are perfect. Good speech is more hidden than greenstone, yet may be found among maids at the grindstones. If you meet a disputant in action, a powerful man superior to you, fold your arms, bend your back. To flout him will not make him agree with you. Make little of the evil speech by not opposing him while he's in action. He will be called an ignoramus. Your self-control will match his pile of words. If you meet a disputant in action, a poor man, not your equal, do not attack him because he is weak. Let him alone. He will confute himself. Do not answer him to relieve your heart. Do not vent yourself against your opponent. Wretched is he who injures a poor man." Here we can see a number of the typical characteristics of the instructional genre. First comes an opening statement, giving the identities of both the alleged author, in this case the vizier Ptah-hotep, and the intended audience, usually a son, actual or virtual, named or unnamed. This is followed by a series of aphorisms, sometimes arranged into stanzas, which urge honesty, modesty, self-control, respect for the powerful, compassion for the weak, and so forth. The advice given in the instructions typically covers a wide range of subjects. Sometimes it is purely practical. If you are one among guests at the table of one greater than you, take what he gives as it is set before you. Look at what is before you. Don't shoot many glances at him. Molesting him offends the ka. Don't speak to him until he summons. One does not know what may displease. Speak when he has addressed you. Then your words will please the heart. But more often there is an ethical concern as well. If you want a perfect conduct, to be free from every evil, guard against the vice of greed, a grievous sickness without cure. There is no treatment for it. It embroils fathers, mothers, and the brothers of the mother. It parts wife from husband. It is a compound of all evils, a bundle of hateful things, and on occasion there is genuine piety and resignation to divine will. People's schemes do not prevail. God's command is what prevails. Live then in the midst of peace. What they give comes by itself. The most important aspect of the instructional genre, the element which either explicitly or implicitly binds together the sometimes disparate aphorisms into a unified whole, is the emphasis on doing mat. As we saw in the last chapter, mat was the Egyptian foundational principle of order, not only the order found in the cosmos, but also in society and in the life of the individual. As Leo Perdue put it, mat is the constitutive order of creation established by the primeval creator deity to direct the harmonious regularity of the cosmos for all eternity. Yet, ma'at is also the constitutive order of society, since the two spheres of cosmos and society are inextricably bound. Furthermore, ma'at is the constitutive order of the individual wise man, who, instructed by wisdom, is able to live according to the dictates of ma'at. Doing ma'at was therefore the responsibility of every human person, from the king down to the lowliest peasant, and failure to carry out that responsibility could have dire consequences, not only for the individual, but for society as a whole. It is no surprise, then, that the instructions strongly encouraged their readers to do ma'at, both in their official duties and in their private lives. In the words of Ptahhotep, "Seek out every beneficent deed, that your conduct may be blameless." Great is ma'at, lasting in effect, unchallenged since the time of Osiris. One punishes the transgressor of laws, though the greedy overlooks this. Baseness may seize riches, yet crime never lands its wares. In the end, it is justice that endures. The wise is known by his wisdom, the great by his good deeds. His heart matches his tongue, his lips are straight when he speaks. He has eyes that see, his ears are made to hear what will profit his son. Acting with ma'at he is free of falsehood. Lo, the good son, the gift of God, exceeds what is told him by his Lord. He will do ma'at when his heart is straight. Not small is what I did on earth. I had 110 years of life as gift of the king, honors exceeding those of the ancestors, by doing ma'at for the king until the state of veneration. In fact, the emphasis on doing ma'at is so strong in the instructions that we may justifiably call them ma'at literature. But as we shall see, they are not the only ancient Egyptian literature which belongs in this category.
The autobiographies.
Closely allied with the instructions were the autobiographical inscriptions left behind by the upper classes in their tombs and on their commemorative stelae. Such autobiographies began in the Old Kingdom with little more than the names and titles of the deceased and his family, and an inventory of the mortuary offerings which were authorized to be celebrated on his behalf. Soon, these bare lists began to be accompanied by a request for prayers and a warning against desecration of the tomb. And finally, the list of titles was gradually fleshed out into a full-fledged autobiography of the deceased. Such tomb autobiographies were not merely recitations of personal accomplishments, although such were certainly included. More importantly, they reflected a personal commitment to the ethical viewpoint depicted in the instructions. As Miriam Lickheim put it, in the autobiographies the deceased claimed to have practiced the precepts that the instructions preached. Among these precepts were respect for parents, solicitude for siblings and offspring, honesty and truthfulness, justice and fairness, kindness and benevolence, loyalty and devotion, vegetation and competence, modesty, serenity, and moderation in all things. Such was the life of virtue which the instructions held forth to their readers. This was what it meant for individual Egyptians to do mot in their personal and professional lives. And this is the kind of life which the subjects of the tomb autobiographies claimed to have lived. Some were quite specific about their deeds. I have given bread to the hungry, clothes to the naked. I listened to the plea of the widow. I gave a home to the orphan. I turned my back on the lover of lies and did not judge the blameless by the liar's words. I answered evil with good and did not seek wickedness. Others spoke in more general terms. I went out from my town. I have descended from my nome. I spoke mot there. I did mot there. Never did I hurt anyone. Never did I let a man spend the night angry about anything I did since the day I was born. In either case, such claims of personal righteousness were not merely a pro forma defense of one's reputation in this world. In the other world, the deceased expected to face the divine assessors in the Hall of Truth, who would determine his ultimate destiny by weighing his heart against mot in the scale of judgment. As the instruction for Mary Carré put it, "The court that judges the wretch, you know they are not lenient on the day of judging the miserable in the hour of doing their task. It is painful when the accuser has knowledge. Do not trust in length of years. They view a lifetime as an hour. A man continues after death. His deeds are set beside him in heaps, and being yonder lasts forever. A fool is he who does what they reprove. He who reaches them without having done wrong will exist there like a god, free striding like the Lord's forever." In short, the instructions urged their readers to do mot and gave practical directions on how to go about it, while the autobiographies asserted that their authors had embraced the advice given in the instructions and carried it out in reality. This is sufficient reason to add the genre of autobiography to the body of mot literature, within which Amenemope must be situated.
Defining mot literature.
We have now identified two distinct but related genres, the instructions and the autobiographies, which both express an ubiquitous concern with knowing and doing mot, and therefore deserve the label of mot literature. But these two genres were certainly not the only ones to concern themselves with mot. If we wish to achieve a reasonably comprehensive description of mot literature, and therefore of the literary context within which Amenemope must be understood, we will have to cast our net more widely. The problem is in deciding just how widely. The instructions were our starting point, and the autobiographies are so closely allied with them as to be an obvious addition to the list. But since mot was the universal foundational principle of Egyptian religion and culture, one might argue that almost every genre of Egyptian literature was concerned with mot at some level or another. As Miriam Lichtheim put it, all literary genres, instructions, autobiographies, laments, tales, and mortuary texts, taught and exemplified the virtues and warned against the vices, and the single unchanging measuring rod was mot, the rightness which the gods upheld, and which it behooved men and women to implement in their daily lives, and thereby offer it to the gods. Consequently, even fictional narratives such as the tale of Sinuhe and the tale of the shipwrecked sailor, which we might be tempted to view as little more than entertainment, can also be seen as self-consciously reflective texts which implicitly grapple with the same issues as one finds in the more explicitly didactic literature: truth and falsehood, order and chaos, individual and society, freedom and destiny. Unfortunately, such an approach would make mot literature almost coextensive with the entire literary output of Egypt, and therefore far too unwieldy to be of any practical use. One must draw the line somewhere, and the obvious place to put it is around those literary works which the Egyptians themselves would have perceived as being most closely allied with the instructions, which were the mot literature par excellence. Fortunately for our purposes, we do not have to resort to guesswork or divination in order to know the minds of the Egyptians themselves on this matter. They have given us the names of some of their greatest authors, not only those who wrote instructions, but also those who composed other works of literature, which were considered to be of comparable value. The most comprehensive such list comes from Papyrus Chester Beatty IV. As for those learned scribes from the time that came after gods, those who predicted what was to come, they have become men whose names endure forever. They made for themselves heirs from their writings, from instructions which they had composed. They appointed for themselves the papyrus roll as a lector priest, and the writing board as a loving son. The instructions are their tombs, the reed pen their child, the stone surface a wife. Is there any here like Harjedef? Is there another like Imhotep? There have been none among our kindred like Neferti or Keti, the foremost of them. I call to your mind the names of Ptahim Jehuti and Kahipereseneb. Is there another like Ptahhotep or Khayers? Those sages who foretold the future, what came forth from their mouths happened. It is found as a saying, it is written in their books. They concealed their magic from the people, but it is read in their instructions. Here we have an explicit mention of Ptahhotep in conjunction with a number of other ancient authors, all of whom are said to have written instructions, and all of whom are described as sages, or RXYHT, those who know things. Such sages served many functions in the world of the ancient Egyptians: magicians and sorcerers, interpreters of dreams, royal advisors, diplomats, physicians, entertainers, architects, and government officials, among others. As the Chester Beatty Sage List demonstrates, they also wrote books, and not just any books, but a set of books which were considered by the Egyptians themselves to constitute precisely the kind of literary canon we are looking for. A number of these same names show up in other ancient writings from widely scattered dates, thereby confirming that these authors were indeed broadly recognized as sages and their writings as classics. An 11th dynasty funerary lament proclaims, "I have heard the words of Imhotep and Harjedef, whose sayings are recited so often." Similarly, a Ramesside prayer from the workmen's village at Deir el-Medina invokes blessings on Keti and specifically names one of his writings, Repetition of Life and the Sight of the Sun to the scribe Keti, invocation offerings of bread and beer before Wenifer, cool water, wine, and linen to his spirit and his company. He whose utterances are excellent, I shall proclaim his name for eternity. It was he who made the book of the instruction of King Sehetepibri, when he was at rest, united with the sky, and entered among the lords of the necropolis. And in the famous 19th dynasty satirical letter, a senior scribe berates a lesser one, with an accusation that the latter does not know the classical literature as he should. "You have come provided with great secrets and have quoted to me one of Harjef's maxims, but you do not know whether it is good or bad. Which stanza precedes it and which one follows it? You are supposed to be an expert scribe at the head of his colleagues, having the lore of every book engraved in your memory." Further confirmation of the high esteem in which these authors were held comes from the fact that quotations from their works are embedded in a number of other texts, although usually without explicit attribution, suggesting that their writings were sufficiently well known for other authors to draw upon them, even centuries later. And finally, there is, or rather was, a tomb illustration and inscription at Saqqara from the 19th dynasty, now commonly referred to as the Deresi fragment. This inscription memorialized, among others, 4 of the sages already known to us from the Chester Beatty Sage List: Imhotep, Keti, Kaheb-Pereseneb, and Khayres, as well as an author who was not listed in Chester Beatty, by the name of Ipuwer. So from the Egyptians' own statements, it appears that we can assemble something approaching a canonical list of sages from Egypt's early dynasties who were also authors of instructions and other related works. If we list them in chronological order according to the dates, which would probably have been assigned to them, accurately or not, by the Egyptians themselves, they are Imhotep, 3rd dynasty; Khayres, 3rd/4th dynasty; Harjef-Def, 4th dynasty; Ptahhotep, 5th dynasty; Ipuwer, 1st intermediate period; Kaheb-Pereseneb, 12th dynasty; Tahem-Jeyoti, possibly 12th dynasty; Nefertiti, 12th dynasty; Keti, the foremost of them all, 12th dynasty. As it turns out, we actually know a fair amount about several of these alleged authors, either from surviving works attributed to them or from other literary or archaeological sources. Imhotep was the architect and chief advisor of the 3rd dynasty king Djoser. As such, he was responsible for designing Djoser's mortuary complex at Saqqara, which is thought to be the oldest large-scale construction with dressed stone in the history of the world. He was also renowned as a physician and sage, and, as we have already noted above, may have been responsible for a reform of the writing system, which made it more suitable for literary purposes. He was eventually deified and worshipped throughout Egypt as a patron of healing. The Greeks identified him with Asclepios. To date, however, we possess no texts attributed to him, and his tomb has not been found. No surviving text explicitly names Carus as its author. Apart from the Chester Beatty Sage List, he is known only from the Deresi fragment, where he is given the title of Vizier. The archaic construction of his name and his pairing in the Sage List with the Old Kingdom sage and Vizier Ptahhotep make it plausible that he too should be assigned to the Old Kingdom, 125, and it has been reasonably suggested that he may have been considered the author of the Instruction for Khegemni, which precedes the Instruction of Ptahhotep in the famous Middle Kingdom manuscript now known as Papyrus Prissi. According to Khagnemni, the instruction was written by a vizier of King Huni, the last ruler of the Third Dynasty, and was addressed to the vizier's own son Khagni. The latter, in turn, became vizier under Snefru, the first king of the Fourth Dynasty. While Huni and Snefru are well known to history, no other mention of a vizier named Khegemni has been unearthed from their reigns, and it has been suggested that the name was misappropriated by the actual author of the instruction for Khegemni from a famous vizier of the Sixth Dynasty king Teti. Harjif was the son of the Fourth Dynasty king Khufu, who built the Great Pyramid at Giza. Harjif's own tomb, which was near that of his father, was vandalized in ancient times, possibly as a result of a contested succession. But he was held in high regard in later centuries, and there is extant a Middle Kingdom tale in which he figures as one of the main characters. The surviving writings attributed to him include the fragmentary Instruction of Harjadef, of which only about 24 lines have been recovered, the long recension of chapter 64 of the Book of the Dead, which he is said to have discovered on a stone tablet under the feet of the god, while inspecting a temple at Hermopolis during the reign of King Menkagore, chapter of that same work, 0.134. It is still disputed which of these texts, if any, were actually his. Ptahhotep was a vizier of the Fifth Dynasty king Isisi. Ptahhotep's tomb survives at Saqqara, and there exist at least 4 copies of an instruction of Ptahhotep which purports to have been written by him for his son. The genuineness of the attribution to Ptahhotep is much disputed. Some continue to defend a 5th Dynasty date, while others regard Ptahhotep as a pseudepigraphic work of the 6th Dynasty, the First Intermediate Period, or even the early Middle Kingdom. As mentioned above, one of the earliest copies of Ptahhotep, Papyrus Prissi, dates from the Middle Kingdom and also contains a fragment of the instruction for Khegemni. Later copies exhibit wholesale revisions, which suggest deliberate editorial activity, designed to produce more up-to-date recensions of the text for use in the scribal schools. Ipuwer was described in the Deresi fragment as an overseer of singers, and he was either the author or the subject of the Admonitions of Ipuwer. The Admonitions is a lamentation over the sorry state of the world in the wake of some sort of national catastrophe, which has often been identified with the collapse of the Old Kingdom and the beginning of the First Intermediate Period. In all probability, Ipuwer was indeed understood that way by the Egyptians themselves, but whether it was actually written that early is a different matter. Some modern scholars have argued strongly that the Admonitions were in fact composed in the First Intermediate Period, a position which can be supported by parallels with other works datable to that same era. Others, however, have attempted to situate Ipuwer within the upheavals of the Second Intermediate Period. It may well be that both views are correct in their own way, because literary and metrical analyses seem to show that Ipuwer as we have it consists of 2 separate works, initially composed during the First Intermediate Period, which were subsequently wedded together and augmented by a 13th Dynasty editor. Khepri-Seneb was a Wab priest at Heliopolis in the Middle Kingdom, probably during the 12th Dynasty. He is the reputed author of the Words of Khepri-Seneb, a mournful reflection on the inadequacy of language, the hardness of the human heart, and the alienation of a wise man in a collapsing world. His name is compounded from the NZW-bit name of Sinusret Teketh, so he cannot be any earlier than that king's reign, and the work's similarity to Ipuwer above and Nefertiti below suggests that it should not be assigned a date much later than theirs. The name of Ptahhotep is unfortunately completely unknown to us outside the Chestwunner Beatty Sage list, but the fact that he is paired in the list with Khepri-Seneb suggests that the two may have lived around the same time, and it has been proposed that Ptahim Jehuti was the reputed author of the Loyalist Instruction, a piece of 12th dynasty political propaganda urging unstinting devotion to the king and patient solidarity with one's fellow citizen. In any case, the titles given in the work's introduction seem intended to suggest that he was a vizier. Neferti, allegedly a lector priest of Bastet during the 4th dynasty, was portrayed as the author of a prophecy purportedly recorded by the hand of King Snefru himself concerning the rise of King Amenemope I as the founder of the 12th dynasty. From internal evidence, it is clear that the prophecy of Neferti 1144 was in fact a piece of royal propaganda composed during the Middle Kingdom, probably in the reign of Amenemhat V himself, to justify the latter's usurpation of the throne from the 11th dynasty king Mentuhotep IV. Because Neferti is described in the Chester Beatty Sage List as one of those who predicted what was to come, and in the prophecy itself as a Zri Hbt or lector priest, an office frequently associated in Egyptian literature with occult powers, it may well be that the prophecy of Neferti was accepted by later Egyptians as an authentic work of the 4th dynasty. On the other hand, the Sage List's pairing of Neferti with the 12th dynasty author Keti, described below, suggests that the prophecy of Neferti was tacitly recognized, at least among those who were in the know, as a pseudepigraphic work of the Middle Kingdom. Last, but certainly not least in our list of sages, is the name of Keti, who is described in the Chester Beatty Sage List as the foremost of them all. In fact, there are at least 2 authors in Egyptian literature who go under the name of Keti, and there could be as many as 3 or 4, some or all of whom were quite likely conflated in the memory of subsequent generations. First, we have King Keti, who ruled at Heracleopolis during the First Intermediate Period and allegedly composed a politically oriented instruction for his son and successor Merikare. Since several kings during this period went by the name of Keti, and the order of their succession is unclear, it is not certain which Keti was thought to be the author of the instruction for Merikare. Some think it may have been Nebkore Keti, in whose reign the fictional tale of the eloquent peasant takes place. Others believe he was Wakare Keti, also known as Keti III. The genuineness of the attribution to any King Keti is also disputed, with suggested dates of composition varying from the First Intermediate Period to the late Middle Kingdom. Next we have the Keti who, as we saw above, was reputed to have composed the Book of the Instruction of King Sehetepre. This latter is the Ninziwit name of the founder of the 12th dynasty, Amenemhat I dynasty, and hence the instruction ascribed to him is usually called the Instruction of Amenemope. That this king could not have been the actual author of the instruction that bears his name is demonstrated by the fact that its long-lost ending, now recovered, clearly portrays the entire document as having been dictated from the beyond by his ghost after he had been murdered in a palace coup. There is every indication, however, that it was composed shortly after the king's death, probably by one of his courtiers, hence the reported attribution to a court official named Keti could in fact be correct. The dead king's purported advice, which primarily concerned affairs of state, was directed to his son, the newly installed Senusret I. There is also a Keti son of Duaf, or Duaketi as he appears in some manuscripts, who was explicitly named as the author of a personal instruction addressed to his son Pepi upon the latter's entry into the palace scribal school. The work is variously dubbed by modern scholars as the Instruction of Keti and the Satire of the Trades, the latter for its vivid description of the sufferings endured by manual laborers as compared to the idyllic life enjoyed by the successful scribe. It is still unclear whether Keti son of Duav was the Keti who allegedly wrote the Instruction of Amenemhat, although a considerable number of modern authorities believe that they are the same person. Finally, one or the other of the previous bearers of the Keti name is also believed by some to be the author of the famous Hymn to Hapi, which is often considered by modern students of ancient Egyptian literature to be the classic poem surviving from that culture. The hymn almost certainly dates from the Middle Kingdom, but whether or not it should be ascribed to the author of one of the other Keti texts is still uncertain. What is clear is that the hymn is not properly a religious text at all in the sense of being derived from or used by an official cultus. Despite its self-description as a dua or adoration of the Nile god Hepi, its turns of phrase are actually appropriated from language normally applied to the king. This completes our initial survey of the works of the Egyptian sages, which we have based largely on the Egyptians' own lists of classical authors as given in Papyrus Chester BD4 and the Durresi fragment. It has produced a substantial crop of literary texts which, one could plausibly argue, constitute the core of a kind of canon of Mot literature. It is clear, however, that while they may all be Mot literature, they do not all lie within the same literary genre. It is to the identification of these genres that we must now turn our attention.
Discerning the genres.
Mat literature, like wisdom literature in general, is usually divided into two broad categories. The didactic or instructional texts, which directly inculcate desired attitudes and behavior, and the more meditative texts, also variously dubbed critical or speculative or contemplative or pessimistic, which reflect and comment on doctrines and values found in the didactic texts. As Jan Assmann put it, the teachings deal with Mot and the individual, the lamentations with society as a whole vis-a-vis the social and political norms of Mot. Accordingly, the first category would include all the various instructions as well as the satire on the trades, while the second category would include Ipuwer, Kak Heperseneb, and Neferti. The hymn to Hapi, however, does not really belong in either category, which suggests that a simple dichotomy is inadequate. Parkinson responded to this inadequacy by dividing the instructional texts into the categories of royal teaching and private teaching, and the reflective texts into discourse and dialogue. Miriam Lichheim took a similar approach, but further subdivided the private teaching category into ordinary teachings and loyalty teachings. In addition, she described the discourse category as laments, a term to which Parkinson rightly took exception. We should also note that some of the works which we have already classed as Mot literature, notably the autobiographies and the hymn to Hapi, still do not fit comfortably into any of the categories defined by either Parkinson or Lichtheim. A more nearly complete categorization of the genres within what we have called Mot literature might therefore be as follows. Instructions, which teach right living, and do so in the form of advice and exhortation spoken by respected elders to juniors. This category would include the instruction for Kajemni, the instruction of Harjadef, the instruction of Tahotep, and the satire of the trades. This is, of course, also the category where the instruction of Amenemope belongs. Autobiographies, which describe how the deceased embraced the virtues taught by the instructions and consequently lived a successful and satisfying life. Royal testaments, which are specialized instructions whose named kingly authors instruct their sons in statecraft. The instruction for Merakher and the instruction of Amenemhat fall into this category. Loyalty teachings, which are specialized instructions designed to enjoin loyalty to the reigning king and hail the blessings of kingship. This is the category in which we should obviously place the loyalist instruction. Discourses, which are speculative or meditative texts calling into question the fundamental assumptions upon which society is based. Some of these are political in character, and beat and lament the overthrow of the social order with its rightful kingship and its descent into lawlessness and civil war. Others are more religious in character and express doubts about the efficacy of preparations for life after death. As Parkinson points out, however, this genre can also include works which do not remain mired in lamentation or questioning, but move to a positive resolution. This category includes the prophecy of Neferti and the words of Kakheperesineb, dialogues, which are works that inveigh against wrongdoing spoken by individuals who have suffered wrongs. These are set within a narrative framework in which the individual's complaints comprise one side of a philosophical debate against one or more opponents, real or imagined. The admonitions of Ipuwer belongs in this category. Hymns and prayers, which are works praising or addressing a deity, the hymn to Hapi goes in this category.
Expanding the list.
It is not enough to restrict our compilation of Mot literature to the works of authors who happen to be listed as sages in the now fragmentary literature and inscriptions of ancient Egypt. We must also add to our collection a number of other works which are substantially similar to these in content, form, style, and vocabulary, even if they have not, to our knowledge, been attributed to one of the official sages. Such works include The Stela of Mentuhotep. This is the mortuary stela of an 11th dynasty overseer of priests in the ancient city of Ianu Montu, Greek Hermonthis, about 10 miles upstream from Thebes. The first 2/3 of the stela contain a typical mortuary autobiography describing deceased's titles and achievements, but the final third contains what some have interpreted as, in effect, an instruction of Mentuhotep. It has been suggested that one, now damaged passage in Mentuhotep was a possible source for, or at least a parallel to, a similar passage in Amenemope. Mentuhotep falls into the autobiographies category. The anonymous instruction of a man for his son, a work similar in tone to the loyalist instruction and probably derived from the same period, i.e. the 12th dynasty. It falls into the category of loyalty teachings. The dispute of a man with his Ba, a fragmentary text in which a man disillusioned with life agonizes over whether or not death would be an improvement and what, if anything, he may expect in the next world. It is extant in a single manuscript of the 12th dynasty and was probably composed sometime during that dynasty. Dispute belongs to the dialogues category. The Tale of the Eloquent Peasant. 192. A story about a poor merchant who seeks justice after being robbed by a nobleman's crooked lackey. Most of the tale consists of the merchant's eloquent pleas for the authorities to do the right thing. These transform what would otherwise be a merely entertaining, if somewhat long-winded tale, into a sophisticated discourse on Mot. The Eloquent Peasant is set in the reign of King Nebkare-Kadi of the First Intermediate Period, but it was actually composed somewhat later, during the early Middle Kingdom. It has a number of affinities with Dispute and Merikere, and it has even been suggested that all three works came from the same hand. The Eloquent Peasant falls into the dialogues category. The Songs of the Harpers, a series of funerary songs from the Middle and New Kingdoms, which attempted to grapple with the transitory nature of life in this world and the uncertainty of the next. The most famous is the Song from the Tomb of King Intef, which conveyed the same deeply skeptical attitude as the dispute of a man with his Ba. Other songs in the genre attempted to mitigate or repudiate the kinds of sentiments expressed in Intef, with varying degrees of assurance 0.197. The Songs of the Harpers belong to the discourse, the Instruction of Ani 198a didactic text, which has been called the obscurest of all Egyptian wisdom texts, 199, due to the paucity of witnesses and the severe corruption of the primary one, Papyrus Bulak 4. The title preserved in one of the secondary witnesses describes Ani as a scribe of the mansion of Nefertari. This was apparently the mortuary temple of Queen Nefertari, wife of the king Ahmose, who founded the 18th dynasty. This ascription, along with the language in which the rest of the instruction is written, indicates that the instruction of Ani can be no earlier than the 18th dynasty, and in fact it is likely that Ani was originally composed sometime toward the end of that dynasty. The instruction of Ani is unique among Egyptian instructions in concluding with an epilogue recounting a heated debate between the author and his son over pedagogical philosophy. It is also, of all the extant instructions, the closest to Amenemope in both tone and language. The Instruction of Amenemope, a New Kingdom instruction pieced together from scattered fragments, notably an ostrakon in the British Museum which contains the first dozen lines. It was written by Amenemope, a scribe in the House of Life, for his apprentice Horman. As we shall see, there are some interesting parallels between the opening lines of Amenemope and the opening lines of Amenemope.